Good evening and welcome to On the Frontline Voting Rights Under Attack. I'm Luz Chavez Gonzalez with United We Dream, and we're so glad you're here with us tonight, and we'll get started in just a minute. Spanish interpretation is provided on this call. If you wish to hear the Spanish interpretation, please select the globe icon on your computer or the more or three dots icon on your tablet or smartphone. Select language interpretation and choose Spanish in the pop-up. Buenas noches y bienvenidos al encuentro virtual de Frontline. Soy Luz Chávez González con United We Dream y estamos muy contentos que están aquí con nosotros hoy y comenzamos en un minuto. Hay interpretación en español. Si desea escuchar la interpretación en español, por favor seleccionar el icónico del globo en la computadora o donde dice More o los tres puntitos en su tableta o su teléfono inteligente. Seleccione Interpretación de idiomas y después español del menú que aparece. Now I'll pass it on to Tiffany Flowers, who will be leading our call tonight.
And welcome to On the Frontline Voting Rights Under Attack. If you're watching on Zoom, please use the chat to say hello and tell us where you're joining from. My name is Tiffany Flowers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the campaign manager of the Frontline. I'm calling in from my lovely home in Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome. For those of you who've been on Frontline mass calls before, welcome back. If this is your first time, we've been waiting for you. Welcome. Again, you're in the right place. The Frontline is made up of a historic, Black-led, multiracial alliance of the Movement for Black Lives, the Working Families Party, United We Dream, and the Rising Majority. The Frontline launched in the wake of 2020 uprisings that flooded the streets with millions of people, many of you and myself, demanding change. For months now, the Frontline has been organizing to protect the right to vote, the fight for racial justice, and elect leaders who prioritize the care and relief our communities need and deserve. If you're new to the Frontline, please take a moment to text Frontline to 30403. You can take your phone out now and text Frontline again to 30403 so that we can stay connected. So before we begin tonight's call, I want to honor the life of Daunte Wright, yet another Black man killed by the police, yet another young Black man who should be here with us today. And I'm going to try really hard to hold it together, friends. My heart breaks for Daunte Wright's family and for George Floyd's family, for Breonna Taylor's family, for Eric Garner's family. And I'm sending lots of love and solidarity to the Black communities mourning and resisting in Minnesota and all across the country. To people like Leslie Redmond, who I know has been in this fight for so long, and who I'm so proud of in her effort to protect and lead in her community. And to all of us Black folks who live with the fear of an interaction with the police ending in murder of ourselves, of our loved ones, this constant trauma being re-triggered. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and it's really hard. I don't know about you, but I can't believe it's Wednesday. I can't believe all we've been through. I can't believe all we continue to go through. And I'm just sending each and every one of you a lot of love. Know that we see you and we feel you. And we hope that somehow, some way, you're able to find a minute to be gentle with yourself and find some peace. Whew. In the middle of the Derek Chauvin trial, even as we're seeking justice for the murder of George Floyd, we witness yet another act of state violence against Black people. Evidence that the police continue to take Black lives with impunity. People are in the streets because they want change. They want accountability. We want to see something different. We want justice. We've got to uproot the systems of policing, criminalization, and white supremacy that killed Dante Wright, George Floyd, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Mike Brown, Atiana Jefferson, Ora Rosser, Stephon Clark, Botham John, Alton Sterling, Janisha Fonville, Tanisha Anderson, Toni McDade, and sweet, precious little 7-year-old Ayana Monet Stanley Jones, and too many more to name. It's high time to divest funds from police departments and invest in the solutions that we know our communities want and need: affordable housing, youth and family services, healing, healthcare, and world-class education and employment, regardless of your zip code. That's the future we're fighting for. But let's get into tonight. Tonight, we're here to talk about voting rights and democracy reform, but it's all connected because we live in a system called racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is white supremacy plus economic exploitation acting together to create and maintain inequality. Racial capitalism determines who gets stopped by the police and whose votes count. Racial capitalism also determines who has access to healthcare, who can move across borders, who has a roof over their head, who gets relief, and who can be free. The history of race in this country, whether we're talking about Black folks, Indigenous folks, immigrants, is defined by a capitalist economy that enables white men to accumulate wealth, land, and power. Historically, voting was a system designed by white property owning men for white property owning men to preserve the power of white property owning men. The voting system was designed to keep people of color, immigrants, and women economically and politically disenfranchised. The voting rights we've won because we organized and we struggled. We're fighting the battles of our ancestors and the battles that our ancestors already fought, died for, and won, which is the right to vote. We're here to make sense of the push and pull of our democracy and what we faced over the last several months. Last November, we saw record voter turnout as historic numbers of youth, people of color, and women hit the polls. But then our democracy faltered as 45 refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, and his lies fed a white supremacist insurrection in the Capitol on January 6th. And when voters in Georgia delivered the Senate to Democrats, how did the GOP in Georgia respond, you ask? With harsh new voter suppression laws. And now many states around the country are looking to follow in Georgia's footsteps. This backlash could set us back 100 years in terms of voting rights. Structural democracy reform has become one of the most important issues of our day. At the federal level, landmark voting rights legislation has passed in the House, but has little chance of advancing in the Senate without filibuster reform. In order to counter voter suppression happening in states all over the country and to protect and expand our right to vote, we need Congress to pass 2 pieces of legislation that would dramatically strengthen our democracy. You'll hear more about this legislation in a little bit, and then we're going to ask you to take action because that's what we have to do, y'all. Right now, we have got to be in action. We have got to be in motion. We have to be reaching out to Congress and our senators and letting them know we want this now. Tonight's call is about the extreme challenges we're facing in addition to everything else in terms of voting rights being under attack, but also the critical opportunity before us. I'd like to ask you all to take a moment, maybe even close your eyes, maybe even try to take a deep breath, and just imagine what we could win if our communities actually had an equal voice in our political system. Just imagine if we didn't have to fight and we didn't have to scrap. If we succeed in winning real democracy reform, that could be the key to unlocking a higher minimum wage, defunding the police, and getting the investment that our communities deserve. A pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, climate justice, healthcare for all, and so much more. All the things our communities need and deserve to truly thrive. So, I know I talked a lot. Let me get into it. We have an exciting agenda for y'all tonight. We're going to start with a musical grounding by Valerie June. Then Pam Spees from the Center for Constitutional Rights will give us some historical context and explain the right wing's coordinated strategy to undermine voting rights. Then we'll have grassroots leaders from Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee talk about the efforts to undermine voting rights in their states and their visions for real democracy reform. Before we get started, I hate that I have to say this, but I want to name that when you call out white supremacy, there's always going to be some haters and there might be some trolls tonight. So if you see hateful messages in the Zoom chat, please flood the chat with love, solidarity, and positivity. I know it's hard right now, y'all, and I know that we just have to keep fighting, and it's unfair that even in our safest spaces they come for us, but it is what it is. We're in it together. So flood the chat with some love. All right, let's get started with a wonderful musical performance by one of my faves, Valerie June.
Well, hey, I'm Valerie June, and this is Working Woman Blues for Jamming for Jobs. Well, I ain't fit to be no mother, and I ain't fit to be no wife. I've been working like all night. I've been working all my life, all my life, all my life. Ain't no dinner from the table, ain't no food in that refrigerator. I go to work till it be back late. I go to work till I be back late. 'Cause I've been working like all night. I've been working all my life, all my life, all my life. Lord, you know I'm a good woman. Lord, you know I'm a good girl. If you want to, you can be strong and kind in this crazy world. Lord, you know that I am ready for my sugar daddy. Lord, you know that I am ready for my sugar daddy. And that's the Working Woman Blues. It's for all the hardworking people, the working class, jamming for jobs. I'm the working class. I'm wearing my blue sweater today, just in honor of them, in honor of us.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm very pleased now to introduce Pam Spees, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. Take it away, Pam.
Thanks a lot, Tiffany, and thank you to all the organizers of this important conversation, this urgent conversation. I want to honor everything Tiffany said earlier, and honor the pain of the moment and so many moments that this conversation is taking place at a time that we are on the brink. I think it's not an understatement to say that. My task is to give a history, sort of a brief history of how we got here, and then speak to the coordinated attack on the right to vote. And everything that Tiffany laid out are things that have been planned. They've been in the works. They did not just happen with Trump or with the election. There's been a coordinated attack for a long time now, and it's part of a much longer attack that goes back to the 15th Amendment. And I'm going to show some slides here, and I wanted to speak to the cover. It's a photograph, and what you see in this photograph is a burial site where people who were enslaved on a plantation here in Louisiana are buried. And it is currently the site where a massive plastics company wants to build a massive facility right in the heart of Cancer Alley, in the heart of a historic Black community. And some of the folks from that community, I think, are on the call tonight. But what this experience of discovering these burial sites has done has reminded me in my body that there is no line between past and present. And we have to carry all of these things with us as we're talking about what we're facing in the moment. And so on that note, Geronimo, would you go to the next slide? I want to talk about the through line of white supremacy. It echoes, it's in what we're dealing with today. And this is the very beginnings of this fight. And in Louisiana, in the Constitutional Convention, where they were developing what would become Jim Crow, they were very specific that they were there to establish the supremacy of the white race. And at that time, they said to the extent to which it could be legally and constitutionally done. Now, this was not the only state constitutional convention where that happened. It was the same thing was said in Mississippi, where they said they were there to exclude the Black voter. And they didn't say Black voter, and they said nothing short of that would answer. And in South Carolina, which to me reminds me of things that we hear from some of the folks who are active today, the former governor and senator there said very clearly they were concerned about being outnumbered. And he said very clearly there were 135,000 Black voters and only 90 or 95,000 white voters. And basically he said, I want to ask you, with the free and fair vote count, how are you going to beat 135,000 by 95,000? And then he said, we had a constitutional convention convened, which took the matter up calmly, deliberately, and avowedly with the purpose of disfranchising as many of them as we could under the 14th and 15th Amendments. This was happening all across the South. And this is what led us right into Jim Crow. Of course, all of this is being accompanied by violence, massacres, lynchings, literacy tests, poll taxes. We all know this. This is not new to most folks who are listening in, but I do think it feels important in these moments to go back and touch some of these facts and some of these touch points. Geronimo, would you go to the next slide? What this translated into, so in Louisiana in 1888, Black voters again outnumbered white voters at the time. By 1904, with the onslaught, with the assault on the right to vote, often carried out through violence, but through some of these laws, that number had dropped to 1,300. Would you go to the next slide? In Alabama, It dropped to 3,000 by 1903. Next slide. And in Mississippi, there were 4.3% voters registered in 1955. So right before we get to 10 years before the Voting Rights Act is enacted, and at a time where there's a groundswell and a very powerful, obviously a very powerful civil rights movement that had endured almost 100 years of this. Would you go to the next slide, Hieronymo, please? And so within that first year, 250,000 people were registered to vote. Now, there was ongoing discrimination, there was ongoing violence, but it was expanding, that the law served to expand the franchise, and people were able to register. There was still a struggle, but it had an impact, clearly. And one of the key ways in which it had an impact was because these states that had been discriminating so viciously had to get pre-clearance for any new laws that might have a discriminatory effect. And so that was one of the key protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so by 2012, you saw at that point, which was a high in the number of registered voters, up to 73%, and it nearly closed the gap between Black and white voters. And then in 2013, if you go to the next slide, Hieronymo, in 2013, the Supreme Court rules in Shelby County v. Holder that the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. And it's fair to say that that opened a floodgate of efforts to disenfranchise. Within hours, I believe Texas passed a voter ID law that had been waiting in the wings. Voter ID laws were something that had been in play. They started to spread rapidly after this. Next slide, please. And then that brings us into Jim Crow 2.0. It didn't just start after this election. We started seeing voter ID, which has massive disparities or causes massive disparities in voter registration and turnout, purges, poll closures, early and absentee limits, and then a whole host of voter intimidation tactics. In Texas, they were threatening people with citizenship investigations. And now at this moment, we're seeing in the aftermath of what we've all just come through, the tidal wave of voter suppression bills that is expanding around these countries in 47 states, 361 and counting. This is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was talking about when she said, if we find this part of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional, it's like throwing out your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. This is what she was talking about. It is raining racism now. If you could go to the next slide. And so in terms of the key players, what's important to know about this is that I think the most key player is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And that is a consortium, well, it's a corporate funded, corporate sponsored consortium of state legislatures and legislators from around the country. And that's basically how the right-wing think tanks and funders and foundations and the GOP entities are able to make all of this go viral, because they have ALEC. They can work it all up, and then the plans get disseminated. It's called fill in the blank legislation, basically, and it can spread really fast. Council for National Policy, a consortium of powerful conservatives that's been at play in all of this. Red Map was a project by the GOP in 2010, which sought to overtake purple states through, and then once they overtook them, deal with the redistricting. Next slide, please. So this is the founder of ALEC, and basically what he's saying is it's very similar to what you heard before, that they don't want everybody to vote. And elections are not won by a majority of the people. That's why these folks are so keen on the Electoral College. And they're very clear that their chances of winning go down the more people vote. Can you go to the next slide? This is an advertisement from ALEC, basically seeking donations to strengthen state sovereignty against the federal government. That's what they're trying to protect, the racist system that has been in place this whole time and it's now sort of been given the go-ahead by the Supreme Court and what's just happened nationally. Next slide, please. Project Red Map, I already mentioned that. If you go to the next slide. This is Chris Jankowski. He's very clear. They had a plan to take over these state legislators and then take over redistricting and gerrymander, which they did. And they were unsuccessful at first until, again, the Supreme Court ruled and said that basically gave them the go-ahead to keep doing what they were doing and put all of those gerrymanders back into play. Next slide, please. And the next slide. This is a press release from 2016 from the North Carolina GOP. They were bragging about the fact that they had been able to reduce the early turnout by African American voters and increase the early turnout by white voters in North Carolina. Next slide. These are some of the architects: Hans von Spakovsky, Cleta Mitchell, who many of you may have seen. She was active in the Stop the Steal campaign. Lisa Nelson, the CEO of ALEC, and J. Christian Adams. All of these folks have been working for years strategizing both about gerrymandering and redistricting. And then the voter ID started to get pushed out through ALEC into all these state legislatures. And what's really alarming is that as early as February of 2020, Lisa Nelson of ALEC was at the Council on National Policy already talking about how they were preparing their membership, their state legislators, to challenge the validity of the November elections. This thing had been in the works way before the election, and a secret working group headed by Cleta Mitchell had been formed in 2019 to start working up the Stop the Steal fraud, basically. And then, of course, we saw the insurrection, what happened with the insurrection, and Council for National Policy was involved in organizing that rally as well. The funders are some of the folks you would have heard about before: Heritage Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, the Koch brothers. This has all been a very coordinated attack, and they are very clear that they can't win if they don't cheat. And 2020, we talk about how high that turnout was. Imagine what that turnout would have been had there not been cheating by the Republicans and all of the rigging that so many of the panelists here are constantly fighting at the state level. Next slide. So I mentioned that this is not an aberration, what we're seeing here. It's actually something that it has echoes of the past. And in New Orleans in 1874, that's when New Orleans was the capital of Louisiana, the White League attempted a coup at that point, and they took over the capital and held it for 3 days until federal troops were sent in, and then they ran away. But that didn't just happen in Louisiana, it happened in Wilmington, where there was a successful coup. So January 6th was not an anomaly. It's just been a long time since it happened on a scale like that. But the violence and the anti-democratic attempts to overthrow elected government and the white supremacist underpinnings have always been there, and they are the same ones that are at play today. Next slide. And so this is why the federal action is urgently needed, because House Bill 1 basically is a response to all of these tactics. They would have an independent electoral commission in the states to deal with redistricting. It would address all of the tactics that these folks have put in play. House Bill 4 would remedy the what happened with Shelby County. So all of these things are important, and they can't happen if the filibuster is there. We know that. I will stop there, and I will just say and hand it back to Tiffany that the hope in all of this is that they are desperate and they know that they have lost and are going to continue to lose. And the movement is more powerful now than it's ever been. And on that note, I'll send it back to you, Tiffany.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you so much for connecting the dots, making sense of the moment, and helping to ground all of us in the continuum that is white supremacy. So as we heard from Pam, now is a critical time to take action, everybody. Like, I know everything is super important all the time. It's the most important election of our lives. We have to do this now, but we absolutely, as Pam just demonstrated to us, have to get this done. Before we hear from our panelists, and I apologize for our technical difficulties that had us starting a little bit later than we'd like, and I hope you'll stay with us because we have a great panel, people on the ground. But before we hear from them about how the battle is playing out in some key states, I want to ask each of you to take a minute right now during the live stream to write your senators. Like, we can walk and talk and chew gum at the same time, right? Write your senators and urge them to pass S1, the For the People Act, and HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You can go to the link on your screen right now and follow the prompts to send the letter to your senators. The For the People Act would make it easier to vote by expanding early voting, ending gerrymandering, and fixing our campaign finance system. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act restores key provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that were gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. So please, please, please go to the link on your screen right now. Follow the instructions to send an urgent message to your senators. If you're new to the front line, every time you come to the call, we got a call to action. We got something for you to do. Tonight, it's a letter to your senators, because if all of us do this, it is impactful. They read them, they see the groundswell. We are the Americans that demonstrate that the overwhelming majority wants this. So these two pieces of legislation are not everything we need in terms of democracy reform. We do need to abolish the filibuster. We do need statehood for DC, because 700,000, yes, 700,000 Americans live in DC and don't have voting representation in Congress. Please, last time I'm going to ask, I'm begging, go to the link on your screen right now to write your senators and ask them to prioritize the passage of these two critical pieces of voting rights legislation. It's for now, it's for the future. If you see a drop-down menu that asks for a category, please put campaign election reform. We need our representatives to do everything in their power to ensure that the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act are both signed into law as soon as possible. Yeah. I grew up in a Baptist church, so usually they'd be like, can I get an amen from the church? So I'm asking y'all to give me an amen by writing a letter to your senator and using the link on your screen. So next up, we're going to hear from an amazing panel of leaders from Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee who are fighting for voting rights and democracy in their states. But first, we're going to watch a short video illustrating the work of the Frontline's election defenders and the joy to the polls, that to ensure that people were able to vote with safety and dignity. Thousands of people, and probably some of you, volunteered to be outside polling locations to help counter misinformation, de-escalate any potential conflict, bring joy and good vibes. Were you out there? I was out there. I was in Philadelphia at a dance party. It's a lot of fun. As people waited in long lines, especially in communities of color, election defenders handed out water, masks, PPE, hand warmers, scarves, and Joy to the Polls did roving concerts to keep people entertained. And now, a lot of this work is actually illegal in Georgia because we did that, So take a look.
Okay, guys, I'm going over here and get my judge I got my grown folks hair on. I got my savage clothes on. I'm ready for this damn heat. And I'm ready for these people. Because I'm going to vote.
Come on, come on, come on. Don't you wanna vote? Come on, come on, come on. Don't you wanna vote? Come on, come on, come on. Don't you wanna vote?
We are monitoring the election.
I'm sorry, it's
to make sure
3302.
everything goes
I
all
apologize.
right. And it's different, we gonna do it right. And then we got protection with us if any trouble come. We have monitors.
That's me.
Yes.
Miss Jackson.
This the NAACP. Miss Jackson. The oldest one in the game. All right.
All right.
Because of you, it is probably because of you, baby. And it's all
I've already told all my friends and family to vote, and now I'm out here making sure that the people in line to do what they do. Their energy is high, their spirits is lifted so that we can get our voices heard. We cannot complain about what's wrong if we're not going to do nothing about it. We have the power, we have voices, and people are actually listening at this point.
women beat their men. Women beat their men.
Come on, come on, come on. Don't you wanna vote? Yes, I want to vote.
Thank you for sharing that video. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's panelists, Toni Watkins, the Deputy Organizing Director of New Georgia Project, Devin Branch, a political organizer from the Texas Organizing Project, and Sekou Franklin from Democracy Nashville, Democratic Communities, who is also an associate professor of political science at Middle Tennessee University. Thank you all so very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump right in. I have a question for each of you. So I think I'll start with Devin. Could you share what's happening in your state? What efforts are underway to undermine voting rights, and why it's so important to you and your community, and what you're doing to stop it? So a lot of questions in one.
Several questions, but I think we can manage them, right? So what happened in what's happening now is really a retaliation for what happened in November of 2020. So in November of 2020, in the state of Texas, we had record voter turnout. 66% of eligible voters in Texas voted in 2020. That is the largest voter turnout that the state of Texas has seen in over 30 years. And that's not the full story. And of that 66% of the voters, we had an increase of 300,000 Black voters in 2020 from the number of Black voters who voted in 2016. And these things didn't happen by themselves. Organizations like the Texas Organizing Project and our allies worked for over a decade to expand the electorate in the state of Texas by reaching out to Black and Latino communities in our major metropolitan areas like Houston, like San Antonio, like Dallas. And these efforts began to, produce results. And so in 2020, not only did we increase the voter turnout, but we increased it because there were measures that were really revolutionary measures that were implemented in the state of Texas to make voting more accessible, like drive-through voting and like 24-hour voting. These were things that brought Texas into the national headlines. Right, 137,000 people participated in these new forms of voting in Harris County. The majority of those people were people of color, Black and Latino people. And so the response to that was the response that was mentioned in the previous introduction. Wherever you have an increase of power for Black and Latino people that threatens the status quo, you have retaliation. So what they came with was the most voter suppression bills of any state in the country. Over 50 voter suppression bills were filed in the state of Texas in retaliation to our record voter turnout, over 50. Two major bills, two omnibus bills that we are fighting against were HB 6 and SB 7. And so what those bills do are they criminalize, HB 6, for instance, criminalizes efforts to make voting by mail more accessible. In fact, it would make it a state jail felony for public officials or others to distribute vote by mail ballot applications without solicitation, a state jail felony. So SB 7 would take the voter measures that we implemented in Harris County and it would ban those things. But not only would it ban drive-through voting, and ban 24-hour voting, it would increase the power of poll watchers to potentially intimidate voters. And not by giving them the right to take photographs and videos in polling locations of people who they perceive to be engaging in violations of voting laws. And this shouldn't be looked at outside of the other context of the Republican Party in the state of Texas. And recently a video came out exposing that, stating that they had a goal of recruiting 10,000 volunteers from the suburbs to go into places like Harris County, where they say all the fraud is occurring. Of course, we know there is no fraud problem in our voting system in Harris County. We had actually the freest, fullest, and fairest elections in the history of the state of Texas in 2020. So we don't have a problem. This is a solution in search of a problem. The problem that they have is the fact that their power is being threatened by the increasing power of Black and Latino communities. And they are seeking to retain their power by disempowering those very same communities. So we are fighting back. So what is happening in order to organize this fight back, and it is not just organizations like TOP. So TOP is one of many organizations that have come together to oppose voter suppression in the state of Texas. So we're not doing it alone. We're working in concert with a coalition of over 40 national and local progressive partners, like Black Voters Matters, like the Texas Civil Rights Project, like Move Texas, to coordinate our actions. And we are realizing that we're fighting an uphill battle in the Texas state legislature, which is completely controlled by the supporters of voter suppression. And so we've been inspired by the efforts, the heroic efforts really, of our comrades in Georgia, who began a corporate escalation campaign targeting those businesses that have given resources and funds to the supporters of voter suppression. So we have highlighted corporations like AT&T, which has given over $574,000 since 2018 to the supporters of voter suppression. So we're calling on AT&T, Southwest Airlines, and other major corporations that are rooted in Texas to stand up and speak out against voter suppression. Many of them made all of these positive statements in the wake of the rebellions following the murder of George Floyd about equity and supporting racial justice, and then but continue to fail to oppose voter suppression. So we're calling on them to do the right thing. Right now, American Airlines, Dell, Microsoft have come out in opposition to HB 6 and SB 7. We call on all major corporations to do the same thing. And so we're going to continue to escalate our corporate targeting with our local and national partners as a way to continue the fight to stop these bills.
Thank you so much, Devin. I think you gave us a wonderful introduction to our comrades at the New Georgia Project. And I'm so thrilled that all of you were here tonight because the South always has something to say. My family roots are in Charleston, South Carolina, so I love to hear from the South. New Georgia Project, tell and say the Frontline says hi. Tell us what you guys are doing right now to fight back. We see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I am always excited for a lead-in inspired by an Andre 3000 quote, because the South does have something to say. And that's what we demonstrated to the nation and to the world, both in November as well as January, which, as I think everyone has already recognized, right, is exactly why we are experiencing these retaliatory tactics of voter suppressionists and voter oppressionists. It's very evident when we see headlines like one I saw today, where it says something like, Republicans don't want ignorant people to vote. Well, that's a testament, right, to what they think of people that look like us, that are the panelists on this call. That's why they can write legislation like SB 202 and the other 81 voter suppression bills that were introduced in our legislative session this year, and think that we do not understand what is happening. But we do know. And we're very, very clear, which is why we have been organizing so vehemently against it. What do we need to happen in Georgia? Unfortunately, Senate Bill 202 has already passed. It is the law. So right now, what we are working to do is put the pressure on federal senators and representatives, as well as the corporations that fund them, to pull back their support. Our corporate accountability campaign has experienced some success, but unfortunately, a lot of that success was too little, too late. People really danced around wanting to make strong statements against SB 202 until after it was passed. And we understand that that was also strategic of them, right? We're not ignorant as people think that we are. We understand that that was a play. And honestly, that did absolutely nothing but make us want to come after them that much harder. Our organization is called the New Georgia Project because what we know is that by the year 2024, white people will no longer be the majority of the state of Georgia. It will be comprised of young, Black, brown, queer, gender nonconforming people, right, who are not represented in our state legislature, in our state houses and state senate. So, looking at what the last few months has been, including the arrest of Representative Park Cannon, right, who was literally doing her job, we see exactly how hard people are working to not only intimidate us, but actively push us out of the rooms that we are meant to be in, including the rooms that we vote, right? When we look at SB 202 and they try and tell us that it's actually expanding elections, again, we are not ignorant. We understand math. We understand that by reducing the amount of days that people can vote, you are not expanding anything. They'll call out numbers as though these laws do not impact us, but the reality is 37% of Black voters voted on Sunday. So forcing our election officials to choose Saturday or Sunday is a direct attack on Black voters. What are we doing about it? As my friend in Texas said, we are still putting our foot on the necks of corporations and asking people in other states who do not have progressive representation to call on their elected officials as well. Because of the work that we did in November and in January, we do have senators that support the passing of House Bill 1 as well as House Bill 4, which outside of the voting laws is also impactful in a state like Georgia because they have written in independent redistricting. That's very important because in October, we will enter another legislative session where the same people that introduced Senate Bill 202, the same people that introduced a bill telling citizens to learn more about how to interact with police as opposed to the other way around, will now be in control of drawing the district lines for the next 10 years. So we have to continue the pressure on our corporations as well as the elected officials across the country to pass House Bill 1 and House Bill 4 on the federal level.
Yes, we all got lots of work to do. But I'm happy to be in the fight with people like New Georgia Project and the Texas Organizing Project. So thank you. Professor Franklin, let the people know about what's going on in Knoxville because I'm sure they don't know.
Well, Tennessee is like the other states is some tough goings here. like most of the other states, our voter suppression laws really picked up after 2010s. We're really a decade into massive attack on Black voters, beginning with the photo ID laws that were passed nearly a decade ago, along with voter purge and all that, or voter purge procedures that really hurt many voters, including voters who were labeled as quote unquote infrequent or inactive voters, which is a different kind of classification. So what's interesting about Tennessee, compared to some of the other southern states, is that Tennessee has trended very red, whereas some of the other states have trended more purple. And Tennessee was never what's called a pre-clearance state. So if you think about Shelby County v. Holder, and that court case that eliminated pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act, that provision of the law never covered Tennessee and some of the other kind of mid-South states. All that being stated is that the voter suppression regime has many legs, many faces. It's pretty asymmetric, and it operates whether you're in a state that's trending purple or blue, or whether you're in a state that's trending ruby red, whether you're in a state that's pre-clearance or whether you're in a state that's never had pre-clearance. The voter suppression regime is quite brutal, and it's asymmetric. It's going to operate in those various states, regardless of whether or not they're going to lose power or whether or not they're going to get more power. And that's what we're finding out. And more recently in Tennessee, in 2019, our state legislature, in response to a surge of Black voters or registered voters, passed a pretty draconian bill criminalizing third-party voter registration groups, and offering and providing or mandating or at least penalizing people up to nearly a year in jail if you violated that law. And that law was particularly targeting African American voter registration groups that were successful in the 2018 round of the election. Fortunately, it took about a year or so of court cases and protests. Thankfully, through the efforts of groups like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and we beat back that case in federal court that forced the Secretary of State to stand down on that particular issue. Yet the voter suppression regime is still in place. We still have a proposal in our state legislature this session that would mandate, I think this is also in other states, that would try to require a fingerprint, that state and local election commissions could fingerprint voters to quote unquote validate those voters. And that fingerprint technology would be administered by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which is basically our state police. And so we're monitoring that bill because that bill would intimidate voters. It brings the police and law enforcement involved in validating voters. And so we're monitoring that bill to see if that bill be up in the past. Just a couple of points too before moving forward. And we're talking about voting rights. The preemption of local laws is pretty prominent in Tennessee and other parts of the South. That is local. Cities are passing laws like living wage laws. We passed a bill in Nashville establishing a community oversight board, and state lawmakers are trying to preempt some of those pieces of legislation, which is an attack on voting rights. Also in Tennessee, we have 95 counties. The local election commissions for all the counties are stacked with Republicans because we have a law that says that whoever controls the state legislature, that party controls the state local election commissions. So that means that those Democratic counties, 4 or 5 of them that are remaining, also have Republican nominated local election commissions. So what are we doing about it? We don't have a corporate campaign just yet. We did experiment last year when they went after our oversight board with a boycott of athletes, 4 or 5-star athletes, to try to convince them not to come to Tennessee. But legal challenges, movement lowering, protests are important. And when it comes to redistricting, we're launching a community-based redistricting project beginning next Thursday, actually, led by the Tennessee NACP. I'm assisting with that, trying to get community input in the redistricting process in order to look at the long game of what that may mean for court cases. But we're going to keep pushing. We desperately need those 2 pieces of legislation to pass at the national level, and we definitely need mass protests and resistance in the streets to really get a comprehensive national voting rights bill and election protection reform bill as well.
So I'm going to ask you bounced my thought right out of my head, so I'm going to bounce it back to you. And we have just a small bit of time, so I'm going to ask our answers to just be a little bit more brief. But you mentioned us getting these two crucial pieces of legislation passed. So if they were to pass, how would that change your work? And then what would your vision be if you could, get those two huge problems kind of off of your back? What would your vision be for how you could continue your work?
So is that question for Sekou or for?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That was for Professor Franklin because he just mentioned the two major pieces of legislation. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should have been clear. When he said the two pieces of legislation, it made me think, well, it sounds like if those two pieces of legislation passed, it would make space for you to be doing a whole lot of other amazing work. So what is your vision for what happens if we are able to actually mobilize and get these laws passed? Then what would your vision be?
Just briefly, the work of voting rights litigators across the country has been quite phenomenal, along with and paired with community-based grassroots resistance groups. And what those two laws would do would offer more legal entry points to challenge state laws that are undermining Black voters. And so it would open up essentially a wider space, a wider set of entry points to legally challenge these laws in concert with movements on the ground. And so that's essentially what they would do. Having worked on voting rights cases with some of these groups, it would do a tremendous amount of offer a tremendous amount of help for us, quite frankly.
I imagine that would be the case. And so for you, Devin, what would be your vision? If we get For the People and we get John Wright's Voting Rights Act, then what's your vision for our next steps?
And also, of course, if we defeat the voter suppression bills in the state of Texas, right, because those are consequential for us, right? We need to defeat these things on the state level as well, where they have traditionally defeated us. And if we are able to do these things and win these major victories, then we can begin to go on the offensive and stop just defending the existing voting rights that we have, which in Texas are already too few. Right? Before they introduced voter suppression laws, we already had one of the most difficult states to vote in the country. And we can go on the offensive and start to expand the voting rights and say that why can't states like Texas and Mississippi and Georgia have the same voting rights as places like Vermont and Maine? Whereas in Texas, we have a woman who went to prison because she voted while she was on parole, Crystal Mason. Whereas in Maine and Vermont, you can vote in prison. Right? So we can begin to go on the offensive and work towards a Texas that's not defending and protecting the interests of the few at the expense of the many, but a Texas for all of us, a Texas for all, that's rooted in voting rights, women's rights, workers' rights, and that works to empower those communities that have been historically suppressed and oppressed in Texas, so that they're able to not just survive, so that our Black and Latino communities don't just survive, but thrive in the state that grew to the current power that it has through the labor and work of our communities. So that's what can happen if we're able to win victory. And we can do that by organizing those communities.
I like the offense and defense frame. So Toni, what does it look like for New Georgia Project to stop playing defense for a season and be able to play offense? What is your vision?
Right. What's really interesting about you mentioning how we've been playing defense, when people talk about the flip that we've seen in Georgia, they think that it was an overnight success. It's been 28 years in the making since 1992, 29 now. So the first thing I will say is that I envision more people that are in the community that we're building power in, running for office, right? We have to be in the room where it happens. In the spirit of Representative Cannon, we have to keep knocking. And one of the most influential ways, and why she was able to knock on that door, right, is because she is a state legislator. So we need to have more young people, more Black people, more brown people, more golden people running for the offices that make the decisions that impact our day-to-day lives. That is when we can begin to see safer communities. That's when we can begin to write and pass the legislation that's going to protect us today and build power for a more liberated and free future as we go into this new Georgia that I was talking about. All eyes are on Georgia right now, both our supporters and the people who are supporting voter suppressionists, right? So what I am excited to see is how we create the blueprint to win under any circumstances.
That's it. That's the word, win under any circumstances. Well, Toni and Professor Franklin and Devin, bless the organizers, bless the teachers, bless the litigators. We thank you so much for sharing what's happening on the ground in your states right now. Please stay in touch with the Frontline. Let us know how to stay aligned and supportive of you. And I just can't say thank you enough for your time tonight. We truly appreciate you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So, friends, I think we're winding down. I know we started a little late and we've gone a little late, so I won't hold you. That's it for tonight. I know you could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to hang out with us on the front line and learn with us on the front line and grow with us on the front line and hopefully get to a place where, as my comrade said, we're getting to a place, friends, where we are on the offense and not the defense, right? So come back next Wednesday, April 21st, same time, same place. It'll be the eve of Earth Day, and our mass call will focus on climate justice. Don't miss it. Please join us. It'll be the last, I know, the last of the Frontline series of mass calls. Mark your calendar, save the date also for the Frontline teach-in on May 15th. It's a Saturday. We try to find a block of time that would work for most folks, and we'll be gathering virtually for a day of learning together. If you like what you got tonight, the 15th is going to be much, much, much more robust. So we will cover climate change, reproductive rights, Black liberation, and so much more. Follow the Frontline on Instagram. Follow the Frontline on Twitter. Text Frontline to 30403. That's 30403. The word Frontline if you want to stay informed and stay in touch. And if you didn't have a chance earlier, please, we talked about the For the People Act. We talked about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need this. The people need this. The streets need this. The Americans need this, whether they know it or not. So please take a moment to fill that out. I can't thank you all enough for joining us again tonight. We'll see you next week. Be safe. Take care. Take extra, extra good care. Good night.